I'm going to kick off. Actually, I'm going to start by reminding you that I'm Rachel, and apologies for a bit of an echo. It might mean that somebody's not on mute, but this is a very, very warm welcome to your Midlands Analyst Network Huddle, and it is the first Huddle of 2022. I hope you all had a lovely break and that your New Year's resolutions are still intact, unlike mine. So for any new people, I hope you'll find these huddles useful by sharing skills and learning from each other's knowledge and experience. And I'll also try and give you updates on our training and development opportunities to make sure that you have really good access to those. And I totally recommend that you take a look at the website to get more details on what's available at the moment, but that is changing all the time. But also, I like to think that this is just a very nice place to be. So there is more info about why we established the network in the first place and the role of these huddles in the files section of the Teams channel. So most of you should have access to that. If you don't, then let me know. And we're always looking to improve the sessions. Of course we are. So do feedback to me if you have any comments or suggestions on how we can make these even better. Anyway, enough of that. I just would like now for you to go to, if you would be so kind, go to menti.com. And while you do that, on the number which is 5369 4576. So that's 5369 4576. I will share my screen very shortly, but I'll just remind you that we're recording today's session. We're going to finish at 12. And we're going to be using Menti as a form of where you can put questions for Dan, in fact, because I know many of you can't access the chat box. And as usual, these sessions are for you. We like to keep them as informal, but as informative as possible. So let's join you in the land of Menti. Okay. Let's see if we can have evidence of people being here with me. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. That is marvelous. Perfect. I don't know how you're all feeling at the moment. It's our first huddle is obviously bound to inspire you to be feeling much better and inspired. But you may just be thinking about this kind of thing. Maybe not. And we asked this about a year ago. We probably asked it a couple of times. I'm still pretty curious to know how many of you are working from home most of the time. I'm working from home 100% of the time, pretty much, bar a couple of outside meetings or meetings that we're having sort of not in an office. But the exciting thing is that the strategy unit is nearly in a position to have an office to go to. When I say nearly, that's probably 3 months away. So that's going to be in Birmingham. So I do hope that at some point soon, ish, we'll be able to meet in person. But I don't think things will replace the online presence, because I think it's so useful, and it makes this type of session much more accessible. Okay, so that's pretty clear that the vast majority of you are working from home 100%, just like me. Okay, and I hope you're finding that continuing to be a positive experience. I think we've asked you before, a lot of people think it's good. There are obviously downsides to it as well. But that's why we're here. This kind of session is here for those, especially who are working from home. So I'm just going to move this on to a slide so that if you do have any questions for Dan, I'm going to introduce you to in a second or two, you can put them on this slide here. So I'll leave that open so you can just go to that one. And at this point, I will in fact introduce you to Dan Isaac. And Dan is tell us about, who are you, Dan?
So my day job, I'm a business intelligence officer at the University of Exeter, but I do data visualization training and consultancy as well. I've been doing that for a few years. I've originally started teaching data visualization in the business school at the University of Exeter as well.
That's fantastic. I mean, I was going to introduce you as a data visualization expert, so I think you should have gone with that.
Okay, I'll go with
Yeah.
next time.
No, so just for everybody's benefit, so Dan has done a strong recommendation. He's done a couple of sessions for the Midlands Analyst so far. So these are day-long sessions where Dan teaches data visualization, and I've been on one of them, and I really enjoyed it. So I asked Dan to come along just to give us a taster session. So not everybody, the places are limited, unfortunately, but we are hoping to repeat those sessions. So I asked Dan to come along and do a taster session and give us some of the highlights of that one-day session. So I've probably repeated Dan's intro, and on that, I'm going to hand over to you, Dan. Go ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I will attempt to share my screen. So hopefully that's come up and you can all see that.
Yep.
So yes, hello everybody. I think I've been introduced. So as mentioned, yeah, I run a sort of one-day, full-day data visualization workshop. Yeah, I've been delivering that for a few years now for various people sort of across the NHS, in higher education, and some sort of private sector clients as well. Yeah, I've been running it through the Midlands Decision Support Network. We're on 2 sessions, another one coming up next month. For this now, over the next half hour or so, I've just picked out a few of the highlights. I've recognised some of the names coming into the huddle have attended already, so these will be things that they've sort of seen already. But yeah, this is 1 or 2 of the sort of main principles of data visualizations, the main things I'd like to share with you. So yeah, I hope you find this interesting. I can't see the chat, just to note that. So if anybody does have any questions, I think yeah, you can pop in the Menti and I'll answer them at the end. But please do feel free just to interrupt me or raise a hand in Teams. I'm happy to answer any questions as I go along as well. So there are 1,000,001 different things that I'd like to share with you all about data visualization. But I just wanted to start off with sort of sharing why it's something that I'm passionate about. And this is one of my favorite ever data visualizations. So this is showing how the average man, the average 21-year-old male in the UK has increased in height over the last 150 years. And as you can see, quite remarkably, the average man is now twice as tall as they were 150 years ago, and quite a bit fatter as well. Now, clearly that's nonsense. Clearly that's nonsense. What's going on here? So we've got this visualization, which is honestly showing us that 150 years ago, the average 21-year-old man was about 166, 167 centimeters tall, while as now they're more like 177. So an increase of about 11 centimeters. But the honest fact of how much that's grown is distorted. When we interpret a chart like this, it looks as if this person has doubled in size, which is false. And why is this happening? Because the y-axis doesn't start at 0. All of these people symbols, restroom men, are sort of hovering in midair. So that gives us a completely distorted sense of the reality of this data. If you go to the BBC's website to look at this same article, you get this kind of odd bar chart with heads. And you get the same kind of impression, though. It appears that this bar here is twice as big, that the average person has grown twice the size, which again is misleading. And it's because the y-axis, despite the fact that they've misleadingly put a 0 there, has got this break here. And it's completely misleading because this isn't the way that we interpret bar charts. We interpret bar charts as being absolute differences. If you were to plot this data honestly in a bar chart with a y-axis at 0, this is what you end up with. So we can see here, yes, the average 21-year-old man has increased in height, but it doesn't look quite as remarkable. But this is the honest representation of that data. You can see why, though, from a journalist point of view, though, this isn't very exciting. The fact is that the average man has increased in height 11 centimeters. That's a remarkable fact. If they were to show it like this, it's almost kind of undermining the significance of that story.
Dan, I'm not sure that slide has moved on.
Oh, hasn't it? Oh, it has in.
Unless I'm just looking at the wrong thing.
I can see 3 charts, Dan, with orange figures in the bottom left, a bar chart in the top right, and a line chart just beneath it.
That's right.
Okay, fine. That's perfect. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. Oh, that's right. So maybe this data could be displayed as a line chart instead, having a line chart that doesn't start at 0. Is that misleading in the same way? I don't think it is, because we read line charts differently. These are the kind of questions that really got me interested in data visualization, thinking about the way that people interpret charts differently, the way they interpret these different types of objects differently. From a rather sort of trivial chart now, I wanted to move on to an example of when data visualization is really important to the extent where ultimately good data visualization can save lives. This is the example drawn from a guy called Edward Tufte of the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. So in January 28th, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff. A disaster by any means. It killed all 7 people on board. Now, after this happened, there was a forensic investigation. What was it that caused this disaster? So there was a suspicion that the disaster may have been caused by an explosion that was caused by the fact that on the rockets, these white things, there are different segments of the rocket which are joined together by rubberized rings known as O-rings. And there was a suspicion that when it was cold, those O-rings could get damaged, and damage those O-rings could then lead to fuel leaks and explosions. So with this suspicion in mind, they commissioned the company that created those rockets to provide them with some data about what damage there had been to those O-rings on the previous launches of the Space Shuttle. This is the visualization that the rocket company provided to them. Now, does this help us answer this question? When it was colder, was there more damage to those O-rings? What are we looking at? We're looking at the pairs of rockets, so that represents each of the previous launches. We've got the temperature in Fahrenheit that's put in the nose of the rocket for some reason. We've got these sort of weird hatchings, which are representing damage to those O-rings on these rockets. Now, you can sort of vaguely understand what we're looking at, and if you spent a long time looking at this, you might be able to answer this question, was there more damage when it's colder? But it's a lot of work. It's really hard to interpret what's going on in this visualization. Here's the same visualization plotted very simply in a scatter plot using Excel. And this is showing on the y-axis how much damage there had been to those O-rings, an index of damage from no damage to complete failure. And across the bottom, the average temperature on the day of launch in Fahrenheit. And as you can see, one glance at this, there appears to be a very clear trend. When it was colder, there appears to be much more likely there was damage to those O-rings. Now, what was the temperature that was forecast on the day of the Space Shuttle Challenger launch? It was in this range, down here, 26 to 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this begs a question. If NASA had been presented with information like this, do you think they still would have gone ahead with the launch of Challenger? And I think, it's hard to think they would. It seems much more likely they would have at least done a lot more investigations. So you can see here how misleading, over-engineered data visualizations can cause confusion and ultimately, lead to disasters. While as simple, effective data visualizations that communicate well can ultimately save lives. I want to mention COVID briefly, just because the pandemic has, I think, seen a bit of a boom in data visualization. Data visualizations are absolutely everywhere now. In terms of how people are communicating about the pandemic. Throughout the last 18 months or nearly 2 years now, we have seen daily news stories talking about number of deaths, hospitalizations, etc., all plotted into charts, and it's become a currency which people are more and more understanding and do help us understand the scope and scale of this pandemic. If you go back to the very beginning of this pandemic as well, Boris Johnson had to convince us all about why lockdowns were necessary. Why was it necessary to have measures to combat this upcoming pandemic? This wasn't an easy thing to convince the public of at the time, but they used this visual metaphor. There was a visualization created like this to help people understand this idea of flattening the curve. If we have no measures in place, we're going to have this steep peak and the NHS will be overwhelmed. But with measures in place, we'll flatten the curve and we'll see, reduced pressure on the NHS. This idea of flattening the curve became commonplace, but it was all based on a visualization. It was based on a visual metaphor, because these visualizations, visual metaphors, are incredibly powerful. When Boris Johnson first stood up to talk about this idea of flattening the curve, though, he used this visualization in his press briefing. A visualization which actually is much harder to read than the simple example we saw on this slide. The color choices are poor. I find it very difficult to even see this sort of turquoise line here. And just the actual scale of it, it doesn't emphasize the point in the same way that is clearly emphasized here. So you can see how simple design choices that we make can have a big influence on how clearly we present the message that we're trying to give to our audience. There are lots of good visualizations out there that really have helped us explore what's going on in the pandemic. I'd highlight John Byrne-Murdoch for the Financial Times. If you're not aware of him, he's created some of the clearest, some of the best data visualizations to help us understand the pandemic over the last couple of years. This is just one recent example, talking about the immunity walls. In terms of different populations and different age groups, how much immunity is there in the population, going from people who've had 3 doses of a vaccine and have been infected, like myself, all the way up to people who've completely immune and naive, have had nothing at all. And you can sort of see, using visualizations like this, how much more exposed to risk certain populations are, certain countries are than others. So John Byrne-Murdoch, yeah, a great idea, creating great visualizations like this, and he's been one of my main sources of understanding the pandemic. I had to share this though, if any of you have seen this recently. This seems to be one of the most controversial data visualizations that's come out in the world of data visualization. There's been a lot of discussion about this. This is looking at, from the New York Times, who have a great graphics desk, produce loads of great data visualizations, showing the number of daily cases in the US since the pandemic started. What do you think about this? Do you think this is a good way of presenting that data? Do you understand what you're looking at here? Is having this spiral help us kind of understand the unraveling of time? And we can see as this band gets wider when those significant number of cases occurred. And we get a sense now of quite how dramatic the increase in cases during the recent wave has been. Or is this spiral completely unnecessary? Does this actually confuse things? Do we end up looking at something that kind of vaguely looks like a tapeworm rather than a data visualization? So this is another great example of one of these things that has been the Marmite of data visualization recently, this chart. Some people love it, some people hate it. Some people think it tells a brilliant story. Other people just think it's completely obscure and hard to read. So there are very few kind of hard rules about this data visualization is great, this one isn't. But there are loads of principles that we can all learn to help us communicate with our data better. I just wanted to share this quote on that front from Stephen Few, who's a kind of guru of data visualization. And he said this, that the skills required for most effectively displaying information are not intuitive and rely largely on principles which must be learned. And this, I guess, is kind of my mission through sort of the data visualization training and whatnot that I deliver. I want to explain this to people, that I think people rely on intuition. They rely on kind of using the same charts that have always been used in the past. They run through a software wizard and just sort of come out with the first visual that Excel or Tableau or Power BI, whatever it might be, spit out for them and think, yes, that'll do. But that is rarely the best way to communicate the story that you're trying to tell with your data. And so that, as I mentioned, is my mission, is to sort of share those principles to understand how do I turn my data visualizations into something which are as effective, as clear, and as beautiful as they can be. So I haven't got a huge amount of time to run through, but I just picked out kind of 6 key principles that I wanted to share with you over the next 20 minutes or so. I'll get through as much as I can. Very quickly, I just wanted to acknowledge the importance of knowing your audience and telling a good story. I wanted to talk a bit about the psychology of effective data visualization. That's really the thing I'm most interested in. I've recently completed a master's in psychology. It's the sort of psychology of communication aspect of visualization that I'm really interested in. I then wanted to quickly introduce the concept of data ink ratios, and then try to convince you that you should never use 3D in a visualization, and that you should say no to pie charts. First off, it is very important to know your audience. I've not got much to say about this other than just emphasizing it as strongly as I can, that often data visualizations fail simply because they haven't addressed the correct audience and they haven't answered the questions that need answering. If you're going to have a successful data visualization, you need to first understand your audience. Who is this visualization for? And you need to understand what questions they actually need answering. And so you always need to make sure you take time on this step before you do anything else. Get to know your audience, speak to them, understand what they need, understand what data they're working with, and then really discuss exactly what questions they need answering. And your data visualizations should aim to answer those questions. So I can't emphasize this point enough, the importance of making sure you know your audience and that you're answering their questions. The next principle I wanted to quickly note was the importance of trying to tell a good story. There are loads of great data visualization stories out there. I told one a moment ago, talking about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. That was me showing you the power of a story. Data visualizations alone sometimes can be kind of dry, they can be hard to engage with if they're not sort of framed as stories. This is a great quote from the Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist, Daniel Kahneman. He said that no one ever made a decision because of a number, they needed a story. And this is just very true. As I mentioned, numbers alone, simple charts alone do not get people engaged. Stories do. I'm currently reading this book, if anyone wants a recommendation, Will Storr's The Science of Storytelling, which really kind of has got me thinking about this more and more. We as human beings are storytellers. It's what our brains are wired to do. Our brains don't like a world of chaos. Our brains are constantly telling stories to make sense of what's going on in the world around them. Stories are immensely powerful. So whenever we want to communicate with our data, we should always aim to frame it as a story. I've not got time to expand on this further, but just to emphasize the importance of storytelling. If I was going to kind of distill how to tell stories with our data in one simple maxim, it would be this, the visual information seeking mantra from Ben Schneiderman, also known as Schneiderman's mantra. Ben Schneiderman's a computer scientist at the University of Maryland, and he says this, that when you create a data visualization, you should give the overview first, then you should zoom and filter, then give the details on demand. Now, how does this relate to storytelling? Well, this is about storytelling because the story is in the overview. More often than not, I certainly find in my day job, people just kind of ask for the details. They ask for the raw data. They ask for these sort of very crude pictures of what's going on in the world. Well, actually, if we start with the overview can give you the story. You can construct the overview in such a way that you have a narrative for your data. You've got a beginning and a middle and an end. This is what you asked for. This is the data that answers that question, and this is what you can do about it. So give the overview first, then give users the ability to zoom and filter, and only give the details on demand. This is a mantra that I use constantly just to help me think. Does this visualization focus on that overview, or is it in the weeds too much? So yeah, great mantra to remember that. Overview first, zoom and filter, details on demand. So that was very, very quickly to mention the idea of storytelling. Next thing I wanted to quickly touch on was the importance of psychology. And I want to mention this pyramid. So when we talk about data visualization, Yes, data, the clue's in the title. We're talking about data, but what we're trying to do is not simply present the data that we have. We're aiming to present that data as information. We're aiming to give information to our audience in such a way that it will give them some knowledge about whatever it is we're communicating to them. And we want them to then have the knowledge to turn that into wisdom, to go out and make wise, effective decisions in the world based on the information that we presented to them. So it's important to note that when we're talking about data visualization, what we're aiming for is not to create some lovely data. What we're aiming for is to get to the top of this pyramid, to actually get that data into people's minds in such a way that they've got brilliant knowledge and brilliant wisdom based on the information that we're presenting to them. Now, I mentioned my interest in psychology, and I really see this gap between knowledge and information being the real challenge for us when we visualize data or when we communicate in any way, really. Information exists as pixels on a screen or ink on a page, but knowledge exists as neurons firing inside a human brain. How do we bridge that gap from visual information outside of us into internal knowledge in our minds? This is where understanding human perception becomes really useful. Human beings are incredibly visual species. About 80%, sorry, I think it's 70% actually, about 70% of all of the sense receptors in the human body are in the retina. The vast majority of information that is flowing into our brains from each of our senses comes through our eyes, comes through our visual means. This is a visualization from David McCandless based on some research from Tor Nordstranders, the bandwidth of our senses. And in this research, he aimed to do this. He aimed to represent how much information is passing through each of our senses as the bandwidth of each of our senses. And you can see it is sight that absolutely dominates. We are a very, very visual species. To sort of emphasize how we're a very visual species, I've got a quick thought experiment for all of you. So I'd just like you to have a think about your childhood home. Now, how many windows were there in your childhood home? Now stop. Where are you standing right now in your mind? Because when you do that thought experiment, most people, they basically are imagining a little version of themselves standing back in their childhood home, and they're walking around into different rooms, kind of counting the windows. When asked to do tasks like this, we turn them into visual metaphors in our head, because that's how we understand the world. We understand the world and we think very visually. But it's important to note that we don't actually see exactly what's going on in the world. We see what our brain is interpreting. Optical illusions are a brilliant way of sort of emphasizing this point. This is one of my favorite, most confusing optical illusions that I've come across recently. Believe it or not, this checkerboard is full of completely straight lines. If you don't believe me, you can kind of put a ruler up to the screen, but every single square is, we've got 90-degree angles. Every line in here is completely straight. But these little circular pebbles or dots on here make us believe we've got this weird distorted effect in the middle. Optical illusions demonstrate to us that, we don't actually see exactly the reality of the world. We see this interpretation of it. This is something known as the Ebbinghaus illusion. The Ebbinghaus illusion shows us how, we've got two different orange dots here, and I'm imagining you will all see the orange dot on the right-hand side as being bigger than the orange dot on the left-hand side. That's not true at all. Both those orange dots are actually exactly the same size. Now this illusion, again, you can see how this then links to data visualization. If we're going to present data represented in bubbles and in an area, we don't see things honestly through the context in which things are presented. In this case, the context of these big grey blue bubbles and the little grey blue bubbles makes our eyes believe that this one is smaller and this one is large, when actually they're exactly the same size. So we really need to kind of understand how human perception works to make sure that we're presenting our data as clearly and as honestly as we can. And one thing, I've got another sort of very quick thought experiment that I will talk through here. I can't chat, so I'll just sort of talk this through. But have a think about how many number 5s there are on this slide. Now, if I were to ask you how many number 5s there were on this slide, you're probably working across very slowly, line by line, and picking out the number 5s. And if any of you are doing this, you can probably count that there's 4 or 5, maybe 6 there, but it's a slow process and it's quite prone to error. Now, if you were to do the exact same thing on this next slide, you can immediately see there are 6 number 5s on this slide. They're the exact same numbers, the exact same sequences, but we've gone from a very slow, controlled process on this slide to something which is very quick and immediate on this slide. Now, this may seem like a very obvious point to make. On this slide, I've taken those number 5s, I've made them black instead of grey, and I've made them bold, so they stand out. But that ability to make them stand out is a really important feature of our human perception. That is something known as pre-attentive attributes of perception. Now, these pre-attentive attributes of perception are these features of the world that we see that stand out immediately, these differences that jump out. We immediately see the colour difference in those number 5s. We immediately see the fact that the lines are a little bit wider. We see them pre-attentively, which basically means before attention. It's subconscious. It happens in a fraction of a second. Now, here are some of those other pre-attentive attributes of perception. So we have things like position. You can immediately see that this circle here is in a different position to these ones over here. That's not something that you can choose not to see. It immediately jumps out at you. Similarly, length. You can immediately see that this line is longer than the others. You see it pre-attentively. You see it immediately. And that's what bar charts do. Bar charts use that pre-attentive attribute of length, so you can immediately see how much longer one bar is than another, how much bigger one data item is than another based on the length of that bar. And because it's a pre-attentive difference, you can see it in a fraction of a second. You don't have to do any work to see those differences. So when you understand what these pre-attentive attributes are, so we have other ones such as the size of an object, the color of the object, its orientation, you can use these pre-attentive attributes to help highlight the trends that you want to present, or to help highlight certain aspects of your data. So I mentioned, bar charts use length. Obviously, things like orientation of a line, whether things are going up and down, how steep that line is, that's how helps us to read line charts. Colour hue. If something is highlighted bright yellow, that will stand out to us. That will draw our attention to that piece that has been highlighted in that way. So these pre-attentive attributes are absolutely key to effective data visualization, because when we understand what these are, we can understand what our user's eye is going to be drawn to and how they're going to interpret the information that we present to them. So again, that's a very quick highlight around some of the psychology. I've mentioned perception. I'm also really interested in the cognition side of things as well, the role that bias plays when people interpret data visualization. But the next thing I wanted to talk about, though, very quickly was the idea of data inc ratios. So if people aren't aware of what data inc ratios are, I will explain that very quickly. And this is a way that you can help to clean up your data visualizations. So every visualization that you look up is made up of data inc and non-data inc. And basically, data inc is everything in a visualization that represents data. So in this visualization here, which is looking at the total student numbers at the University of Exeter, we've got a line which is showing the increase in the number of students at the University of Exeter, where I work. Now, that clearly is data, so that's data inc. The labels on the y-axis are showing the number of students. So that's data, data Inc. too. The year labels, that's data as well. The title in this case is actually Data Inc. because without that, we wouldn't know what we're talking about here. It's actually representing data. So all of those things that represent data are Data Inc. And everything else is non-Data Inc. So the non-Data Inc. in this example will be the yellow background. It will be this blue area under the line. It will be the blue border around the outside, the unnecessary decimal places, the heavy grid lines. All of these things are non-Data Inc. Now, when we understand this difference between Data Inc. and non-Data Inc., we can revisit our data visualizations and think about them in terms of aiming to reduce the non-Data Inc. and enhance the Data Inc. So this is a very sort of simple idea, and it's not absolute. You don't want to get rid of all of the non-Data Inc. and only have Data Inc. And you don't want to show all of your data. You only want to show the data that is most relevant. But the point is reduce the non-Data Inc. and enhance the Data Inc. so that your non-Data Inc. is actually helping to enforce the data and tell the story that the data is trying to tell. So if I was going to come up with a more Data Inc. ratio friendly version of this visualization, we could use this. This, again, mocked up in Excel very quickly. It's not the most beautiful visualization in the world. It's just something that's very simple. The only non-Data Inc. in this visualization, though, is the grid lines. The grid lines are the only thing that is non-Data Inc., but they're actually helping to enforce the Data Inc. Without the grid lines, you wouldn't be able to read the gradient of the line so clearly. You wouldn't be able to read the values of that line quite so clearly. So the non-Data Inc., the grid lines, is helping to enhance the Data Inc., but it's the data that is the forefront. There is no ambiguity in this line chart. You see a line, you see the data predominantly, and that pattern of increasing student numbers is abundantly clear, and you're not being distracted by unnecessary fluff, for want of a better word. So Data Inc. ratios always aim to enhance your Data Inc. and reduce your non-Data Inc. So two more, a quote there from Edward Tufte. Edward Tufte is the guy who came up with this idea of Data Inc. ratios, and he also said this, that above all else, show the data. It should always be the data that stands out when you look at a visualization. If your eyes are being distracted by unnecessary colors or shapes, get rid of those, make sure it's the data that is at the forefront. Two more principles that I wanted to very quickly try and convince you of. And the first of those is why I think you should never use 3D. 3D is incredibly hard to read for human beings. Human beings find it incredibly difficult to read three-dimensional representations of space on two-dimensional surfaces. This is another optical illusion here, where basically our mind is kind of interpreting this three-dimensional plane, like a tunnel, and it looks like this pillar here is taller than this one and this one. It's not. Those three pillars in effect are exactly the same size, but our brains cannot process these kind of odd distortions of three-dimensional space. To emphasize this point in a data visualization, I've got a data visualization here, which I've made 3D. I wanted to share with you the top 3 selling albums of all time in the UK. And I've got a question for you. Looking at this, how many copies of Queen's Greatest Hits have been sold? Now just have a think, looking at this visualization, how many copies of Queen's Greatest Hits have been sold? So how am I supposed to read the pinnacle of this weird cone thing? Does that sort of bisect the y-axis around about sort of here? Is it about 8 million? Actually, it crosses around about here, so maybe it's about 5 million. The actual answer is 6.6 million, as we can see here in this simple table. Now you may be thinking, how on earth is that 6.6 million? Well, the fact is that this sort of three-dimensional plane bisects about halfway back. It's impossible to describe, especially without being able to point at things. But this point here, it bisects the line about here because we're halfway into the depth of the visualization. So it is honestly 6.6 million, but you can see how hard it is for us to interpret that and how wide the amount of error would be in terms of how easily people could misinterpret that. In this case, using 3D was completely over-engineering this visualization. A simple table tells you all that you need to know about the 3 top-selling albums of all time in the UK. But making things three-dimensional always distorts and makes it much more difficult to interpret a visualization. The only place for 3D I've seen is in some really kind of cutting-edge stuff around kind of like mapping the ocean floor or something like that, where we can't see the ocean floor. So creating three-dimensional models of the ocean floor is useful. Things in the world of like virtual reality, where people are manipulating 3D objects. There's some scope there, but that is not what most of us are dealing with. And we should absolutely avoid adding 3D to the basic charts that we use to communicate our data. Now, the final point I wanted to note very quickly, leaving time for questions, is why I think you should say no to pie charts. And to help you understand why I think you should say no to pie charts, I'd like to have a think about how many times bigger you think this circle is compared to this circle here. How many times bigger do you think that is? Is it maybe 5 times bigger? 20 times bigger? 40 times bigger? Within that range, how comfortable are you making a guess about how many times bigger this circle is than this circle? The correct answer is 18. This circle here is 18 times bigger than this one. But hopefully you've seen through thinking about it yourself that human beings are really bad at making judgments like that. I've run this this course a lot of times, and the number of guesses I get range from 4 up to about 60. People make all kinds of guesses, and hardly anybody can get anywhere near the accurate figure of 18 times bigger. People are really bad at making judgments about how much bigger one object is than another. And this is the problem with pie charts. When somebody looks at a pie chart, we are predominantly asking them to make judgments about how big each segment of pie is. And we're not very good about making those judgments as to how much bigger one segment is than another. Have a look at this one. Which is bigger, the green segment, orange segment, the yellow segment? You can begin to get some sense that that one looks a little bit bigger. Maybe this is, 10% bigger, but it's difficult. It's not something we're good at. Admittedly, you've also got the data encoded into the angle in the middle. You've got the data encoded into the length of the arc around the outside as well. So pie charts are a little bit more complicated than just looking at area, but we're not very good at any of those things either. Does making our pie chart 3D and exploding it to make it look exciting and engaging for our audience, does this help? No, you end up with something which is very, very hard to interpret. We've gone, you see how much this green segment has shrunk? We've got these unnecessary sides of our segments, which are not data at all. It makes things much worse. It looks old-fashioned, it looks messy. Avoid doing stuff like that. Always use a bar chart, I would say, instead of a pie chart. Bar charts are so much easier to read, again, because of that pre-attentive attribute of length. We can read the length of these bars so much more easily than we can read the area of these segments. And you can immediately see how much bigger one object is than another in a bar chart in a way that you just can't in a pie chart. So I don't think I've used a pie chart in more than 5 years now. I'm not as sort of militantly anti-pie charts as I maybe used to be. I think occasionally they can have their place, but I would certainly not use one unless you can really justify it. So that was some of the key principles that I've just run through. I hope you've been able to take some of that on board, because I've tried to cover quite a lot in a short space of time to give you a taster. Talk about knowing your audience, tell a good story, know your psychology, be aware of data ink ratios, avoid 3D, and say no to pie charts. One final quote: simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And I think this is a very simple one rule to remember. Keep things simple, and most of the time, not only is it clearer, but it's usually more elegant as well. I'll skip over that one because I think I'm over time. But yeah, that's it from me. I hope you all found that interesting. As mentioned, all of that is sort of some highlights which I talk about in more detail in my full day course. So yeah, please let me know. If you've got any questions now, very happy to answer them. If you want to know more about the course, then get in touch with myself or Rachel, I guess, as well.
That's no, that's great, Dan. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. We've had a couple of comments as opposed to questions. So in the chat there were a couple of somebody who was just checking on the name of the book that you referenced. I think we sorted that one out. I think Karen made a note of that one.
This one?
Yeah, that's it.
The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Andy had to leave, but he thought it was a great talk, Dan. That's what he said before he left. And Karen has also said it was a great presentation. So thanks very much for that. And she's ordered the book already, and I know that's true. Yeah, and I'm not surprised. That's great. So in the comments, we didn't have questions as such, but somebody at the time, I didn't interrupt you, but they did make a comment on I think it was it the New York Times spiral?
Yeah.
Is it worse than a pie chart? Was the comment? Yeah. So I mean, I didn't like it. I don't know how typical I am of sort of interacting with visualizations. I didn't like it either.
I found that quite interesting. Most people seem to hate it, but I seem to be one of the few that likes it. I think there's something about time is an interesting one, and people kind of visualize time in different ways. I think most people think of time as like a horizontal plane, just moving from left to right, and that's why line charts work well to show time. But there is a sense in which time is cyclical. And it expands, and so it kind of worked quite well for me, but maybe I'm an outlier.
I think I don't know. Maybe you can get used to that kind of sort of visualization, and sort of when you get it, then you can sort of like you can understand it. But I think you're and also it was the New York Times, as you're saying, they spend a lot of time developing these visualizations, don't they? You said they do a lot. So
well, you need your trendsetters as well. You do need those people obviously who are going to take a convention and do something different. And in 10 years' time, we might see these spiral charts everywhere. We don't know, but somebody needs to kind of invent these things and try them out. Yeah,
absolutely. So there's another comment about Queen's greatest hits, not enough or too many. That was obviously just a comment. One's just arrived. Any specific hints or tips around Data Viz for those who are visually impaired, or stick with keep it simple?
Absolutely, keep it simple. And I think obviously the less you've got going on in a visualization, the more it is to be able to identify the pertinent details. I would say, accessibility in visualization is something I'm certainly keen to know more about myself, because I think it is a notoriously difficult area, because what you're aiming to do on one hand with data visualization is, utilize our visual capacities as much as possible. But then obviously, like you said, you need for people with visual impairments, and obviously there's lots of types of visual impairment as well. You need to make sure that they are accessible. There's a whole great load of literature in there about color blindness in particular. I think it's 1 in 10 men in particular are red-green colorblind. So it's certainly important to try and avoid using red and green to compare things, and avoid using the traffic light system of green is good and red is bad because of color blindness issues. But there are loads of other populations that have different difficulties. So that obviously, the more we know about that, the better. And as mentioned, personally, that's something I'm interested in learning more about. Okay,
before we go on to the other comments that I've had, I've just noticed somebody has their hand up, and I think it's let me see, is it Claire?
I can see as Zoe's got a hand up.
It's Zoe. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I did have my hand up as well, but sorry, I'll just.
What's your hand? Do you want to go first?
Zoe.
Oh, yeah, you're being too polite. I just wanted to say, you said about knowing your audience. I encountered that with a pie chart once, where I showed a person who deals with this, doesn't do data, let's say, just is a frontline staff member. And I said, here's a pie chart and here's the square thing, where you just it's really good if you're just showing two things, you just so you have like 100 square grid and then you just color in the dots or the squares, mini squares in it. And she immediately said, pie chart's better, because she's familiar with it.
Yeah.
And having a child that's in primary school, it's because it's colourful and they teach them it very early on. And I'm not saying in support of pie charts, it's a bit of a clash, isn't it? Know your audience. Yep. They like colours, they like refresh things, they like new things. But then as data analysts or statisticians or data scientists, we go, you can't interpret that.
Yeah.
So actually knowing your audience might not be brilliant, because I do know my audience, and I kind of feel like we need to educate them, but we shouldn't need to educate them. Like the spiral, I think that is really useful because it comes from the coxcomb, which was Nightingale's Crimea War statistic, which was also where the pie chart possibly came about from William Farr. But you need to stare at it for a while. It's not easy to look at it. It's brilliant visualization, but it's not actually intuitive.
Yep.
So knowing your audience, maybe the audience needs to know the data. But I will actually echo what you said about William Storr. It's a brilliant book. I've read it. And John Byrne Murdoch, he also suggested writing words in the NHSR conference, writing the bit that you want, because eyes go straight to the text, which is interesting because that's combining data visualizations with words. So we're telling a story, but in the chart. So yeah, excellent. Thank you. Oh, and another thing from somebody else, because there's some amazing people out there in our communities. Paria, who worked on the PHE dashboard for COVID, did some data, and he showed some colours in the AFA conference, I think it was, and he said, what's wrong with this? And nobody could remember, nobody knew. It wasn't about accessibility, it was because the use of the colour orange for Northern Ireland specifically would have caused a cultural furore, and he picked that up, and I was like, oh, that's amazing. I'd forgotten that. Know your audience, don't insult your audience, make it accessible for your audience. The audience is so difficult, isn't it?
Yeah. There's on that last point, there's a branch known as value sensitive design around that, which is exactly that, making sure your colours are not sort of offending.
Oh,
but all kinds of other considerations as well, knowing your audience and making sure you're not kind of perpetuating any values which are, not things you would want to be associated with.
Okay, thanks, Zoe. That was really insightful. That's brilliant. Thanks, Claire.
Apologies, I did have my hand up and then I started typing in Menti, but I'll go back.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. That was really, really useful and a great presentation. And I definitely agree with your mantra of keeping things simple, most definitely. My question was just, what's your view on tree maps? Do you put them alongside pie charts and not being so useful? Because I kind of like them, but we've kind of, in my team, we kind of have a bit of a conversation about them, and some people don't like them and some people think they're okay. So just wondering what your thoughts were on them.
I think tree maps have the same problem as pie charts. It is still hard to make those judgments about the different size of the area of those rectangles in a tree map. I mean, depending exactly how complex your tree map is, sometimes you are kind of like making simpler judgments about how much longer they are and stuff, but I think generally you have the same issue, and if you break it down into a bar chart, it does become immediately more apparent. But the thing that tree maps do well is you can fit lots and lots of different data items into a tree map and use color to group things together. And so I think, as with everything, they have their place. And I sort of said a principle of data visualization, I would say, is that there are no kind of like hard, fast rules of this is the right way of doing things, this is the wrong way of doing things. And I'm sure there are places where tree maps are the best option, but just take that time to always challenge yourself and think, in this case, does that work? Could I do it better? Is there a sort of simpler alternative that might communicate this data more clearly?
Oh, definitely. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So we've had a couple of other comments. There's actually too many on Menti, but I'll pick out one or two. There are a couple in the chat box as well. I'm just trying to think which one I can do. So thanks, Dan. Really useful and enjoyable. Meeting the legal accessibility standards at the same time as trying to be more visual is a real challenge.
Yeah.
Bordering on becoming a barrier. Other people you'd recommend? Are there any other authors or data visualization in people to inspire the audience?
My favorite data visualization writer is Alberto Cairo. He's got a book called How Charts Lie, which is quite easy to read and accessible. I think that's one name that immediately springs to mind, but there are loads of great writers out there.
Okay, there's a couple of comments in the chat. So someone is saying, Ronnie is saying that it was a great presentation. Totally agree. So and I think there is a thing, and this happened to me as well. I was thinking I know a lot of this stuff, but having it sort of presented back to you when you can sort of stop and reflect and actually consider the principles as opposed to just thinking you know how to do stuff. I found that really useful, and I just found it like a really useful, not just a reminder, but it was new stuff to me as well, in sort of organizing it and that time that you take, excuse me, to I get the knowing the audience stuff and knowing the question stuff, but just taking that time to just sort of present your findings in a way that is just making sure that message is well and truly reached by those people. I think that's so that I found that really, really useful. Just there was another comments. Somebody commented on Andrew commented on saying how do we make sure that this is part of our initial continued learning as analysts, linking with developments around competency frameworks going forward. Yep, that's a really good point. Okay, well, excuse me. I've just noticed the time. This is the time that we actually do have quite a few more comments on Menti that I'm going to share with you afterwards, Dan, because obviously we're in contact, aren't we? But thank you so much for coming along today. I find that a fascinating presentation. Really interested in sort of all aspects of that. Particularly interested in the psychology of some of this as well as you are. And I'm sure you'll be delighted to come back one day. But we have recorded this session, so we can go back and look at it again. So thanks very much, Dan, and I'll see you soon.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for listening.
See everybody in a couple of weeks. Enjoy your day.